Okay, very good. Welcome back. Hope you had a great holiday, even though I just found out that some of you are in self-isolation. Hope you still got time to recharge your batteries. So welcome back to the Animal Rights Law course. This is the second term, obviously. In the first term, we covered the basics of animal welfare law. We looked at specifically the law of the UK, EU, some comparisons as well, and we also considered some of the more jurisprudential, philosophical debates surrounding animal rights. You'll probably find that the second term is much more applied, especially toward the sort of mid-term, and toward the end of the term we're going to be talking a lot about cases, about strategy, about model animal rights law. So it's going to get a bit more hands-on, and to sort of lay the foundation for this, we want to start the first half of the term by looking at the relationship between animal rights and human rights, which is a really important question to be discussed, not least because human rights is, of course, a much more concrete phenomenon. We already have a sense of what they are, and a lot of the discussion is about how is animal rights different from human rights. And this first lecture that I will give will cover some more theoretical aspects of the relationship between the two. How can we look at animal rights? What's the relationship to human rights? In lecture 10 and 11, Professor Kirsty Hughes will then focus specifically on the European Court of Human Rights and how it has been dealing with animal rights and animal rights related cases. So that's coming up after this more foundational lecture. Okay, here's an outline of what we will be talking about today. I thought that perhaps the most helpful way of approaching this topic, animal rights, human rights, is to look at two extreme views, if you like. The first view is that human rights and animal rights are in conflict with each other. Animal rights specifically are viewed as problematic because they seem to undermine human rights. So there's a tension here, a conflict that we need to resolve by essentially getting rid of animal rights, by not allowing them to exist, if you like. That's one extreme view, and we're going to look at different aspects, different facets of that view. Then there's the opposing view that basically says, oh, no need to worry, human rights and animal rights are perfectly compatible. There's a neat harmony here. So there's no problem. Let's go for animal rights, and they're going to also support human rights. After looking at these two positions, we'll consider some more practical ways forward that are perhaps a bit more nuanced, that try to find a middle ground between these two extreme views. And as always, we will conclude with a few more general remarks. Okay, let us start then with the first extreme view, if you like. And it's this view that human rights and animal rights are in tension. Now, one particularly widespread assumption or statement or claim that you can find is that just in virtue of being human, in virtue of belonging to the human species, all human beings have a special moral status and a special legal status that only they should have, and that animals should not be allowed to have as well. If they are allowed to have it, it would dilute, it would undermine the special status, the special rights, the equality that only human beings have, indeed, simply in virtue of being human. That's the sort of the general idea here that you can find in, I think, a lot of the readings that you will have done or may be doing soon. We can find this view in scholarship. This is David Miller from the University of Oxford, who says, all theories of human rights assert that they are rights a person has simply in virtue of being human. Right? Just because we're human beings, we have these rights. And it's not just a view that scholars have. You can find it in human rights practice, in human rights documents. So take the American Convention on Human Rights. This convention says that the essential rights of man are not derived from one's being a national of a certain state, but they are based upon attributes of the human personality, right? So it's not my being, Swiss, or someone's being British, or any other sort of nationality that gives us rights. No, it's because we have certain attributes that are special about humans, right? So somewhat different, you might say. The first is more about just belonging to human species, perhaps. This one is saying special features, attributes that only humans have, right? So two slightly different ways of trying to explain a similar idea. Specifically, I think we can distinguish between three justifications for this idea that humans have this special status that animals should not have, and therefore potentially animal rights would be in tension with human rights. The first justification is what we might call a foundational justification. We're going to look at that in detail. It's basically the idea that humans have special rights, special status, because we can ground those rights, that status, in something concrete about these humans. Maybe they have a special ability that no one else has. It tries to ground, it tries to find a foundation, if you like, hence a foundational justification. There are also approaches that say, no, that's problematic, and we're going to see why they think that. Let's just say that humans have human rights. Let's just decide that they should have them. Let's just assume that they have these rights. We don't need to ground it in anything specific. We don't need to pin it down, find a specific empirical feature that explains it. And then lastly, there's what I call here strategic justifications, which basically say, I don't care whether what I'm arguing for is foundational, anti-foundational. I just think there are good strategic reasons for making human rights exclusive to humans. Let's start with the first one, these foundational justifications, if you like. So if you read human rights scholarship, especially of the philosophical nature, you will come across the view that only human beings have human rights, which we understand here as thick rights, right? As we defined them last term, i.e. rights protecting vital interests, life, liberty, integrity, family. They're not easily traded off, and they're not just a mere reflection of a duty, right? So they're thick rights, not thin rights, as we define them. One first ground foundation, if you like, is that, well, only humans belong to the human species, right? Only humans have human DNA, if you like. Only they are members of Homo sapiens. Now, this has been criticized mainly for the reason that it runs into the problem of speciesism, right, that we discussed last term, and we're going to pick this up again in a few minutes. This has been viewed as perhaps slightly problematic because, okay, why should being a member of Homo sapiens be so relevant for holding human rights? Haven't similar arguments been made about members of other ethnic groups and why we should exclude them? So there's an element of arbitrariness. No need to rehearse those arguments here. We've already come across them. So if the membership itself might not be the best ground, then other attributes have been proposed that supposedly only humans have, that make us special, that explain why only we should have certain rights. Rational autonomy, for instance, philosopher Kant, this idea that we can create laws for ourselves and follow these laws. Kant thought that's an ability that only humans have. Personhood, James Griffin believed that only humans have a conception of their own good, can choose their own good. Only they are persons, and only persons should have human rights, he believed. Another one is language, for instance. George Kateb, only humans have language, and that explains why we're special, why we have those rights. Culture, yet another one. The list goes on, basically. There's so many candidates for why supposedly human beings are special. You may have come across other ones. Only humans use tools, or only humans make tools. There's a whole range of potential reasons, grounds, if you like, for why humans should have that special status. Now, there's some issues with that approach, that foundational approach. One issue is the speciesist issue, which we've seen with the idea that human membership in a human species should be a ground. But also the attributes-based approach faces some issues. Now, the first one is what we might call the problem of over-inclusiveness. You might say that, yes, perhaps Kant was right in saying that humans have rational autonomy. Or, as we saw here, Rolston may have been right that humans have culture. The problem is, there may be other animals out there that also have that feature. Right? So even if all humans have it, some animals may have it too. And then that's a problem, of course, if your view is that that explains why only humans should have these rights. And I found a really nice clip on YouTube talking about this idea that perhaps not just humans have culture, but also some other species, and how that can therefore not be the criterion that we're using for exclusive rights holdership of humans. Let's see if this works.
Although termite fishing is common among chimps, every group has its own tools and techniques. These are a part of their traditions, their cultures. Chimp culture? The term seems like an oxymoron. We like to think of culture as the pinnacles of human achievement, of art, history, and science. But in anthropological terms, culture is the transmission of group knowledge from one generation to another. Little Tava is doing her best to master one of the great arts of her culture, whether she knows it or not. It usually takes 4 or 5 years to master the technique. But today, she has an early triumph. The idea.
So what they're doing is they're using the stick to fish for termites in the hill, in case that wasn't quite clear.
Chimp culture, once radical, is now increasingly accepted among primatologists. Chimps around Africa use different techniques to smash nuts and fruits. Some use wooden hammers and anvils, some stones. And the Fangoli chimps slam baobab fruits against stones or trees. One of the most interesting and subtle things most chimps engage in is something called leaf clipping, biting off bits of leaves with a distinct popping sound to get each other's attention. But it means different things in different places. In some places, it's a come-on to the ladies. Here in Fangoli, it's a back off to other males. Or a part of an exciting development in their lives. Like a nice fruit tree.
I sort of advertising themselves, but also just excited because they're starting to eat again. And chimps get excited with everything.
Here in Fangoli, leaf clipping among males means an enemy to extravagant tantrums. It's traditions passed down from adult to child. It's a flow of knowledge that once only we seemed capable of.
There's also the inverse problem, if you like, of under-inclusiveness. You may well find that, no, animals have certain attributes, certain features, but then perhaps not all humans have those relevant features. Take rational autonomy in the Kantian sense. It is very well possible that children, perhaps humans with severe mental disabilities, they may not have rational autonomy. So if we ground human rights in that criterion, we may not be able to include all humans. Okay, moving on. Some people have defended what we've called anti-foundational justifications because they saw the issues or see the issues with the foundational justifications that we just discussed. Anne Phillips is a political scientist at LSE who takes that approach, and she puts it as follows. She says, we are not equal or have human rights by extension because of certain facts about ourselves, because we have culture, language, and all these things that we just saw. Say you have a soul, rational, being irrational agents, or being sentient. Though we may and often do articulate our claims in one or other of these languages, equality is something we assert and to which we commit ourselves rather than something we find out, right? So equality or human rights, it's not something that we can empirically find out by identifying a specific attribute or feature in us. It's just something we decide we should have. We assert that all humans have human rights, and that's all we need. In fact, we should not even go down that foundational road, because it might lead us to find that, oops, some humans may in fact lack rational autonomy or some other feature that we thought was grounding of rights, and therefore we would have to take the rights away from these humans because they don't have the relevant features, right? She doesn't want to go there and thinks it's much safer if we just assert that we have these rights, or that status more generally. Richard Rorty, an American philosopher, developed a similar argument, focusing just on human rights. He said, and he's a pragmatist, he says, pragmatists argue from the fact that the emergence of the human rights culture seems to owe nothing to increased moral knowledge and everything to hearing sad and sentimental stories. What he's saying here is that the reason why we have a human rights culture isn't that some scientist found out that humans have a special gene or a special feature that only humans have, and therefore we should have human rights. No, it's because we have been hearing and telling sad and sentimental stories, making us feel more inclined to protect human rights. Maybe a sad story of a child suffering somewhere, a wartime situation, whatever the story may be. So he thinks human rights is not a matter of knowing which grounds there are for human rights. It's about telling sad, sentimental stories. There's some issues with that approach too, I think, and some obvious ones. How do you convince someone of your approach, of your theory of human rights, if they're not willing to accept that decision, assertion, or that story? Maybe they don't believe in the story. Maybe they're not moved by a sad story about human rights. Maybe they don't accept the idea that we should just assert that all humans have these rights. For someone who is an anti-foundational thinker, if you like, it's very difficult to convince you because they cannot say, yes, but look, humans have feature X, because they are not willing to go there. They don't want to ground, right? So they have a problem. Another problem is the discrepancy that this decision, these stories, can then evince when we compare them to the actual situation, the actual reality, right? So an animal rights thinker might say to Anne Phillips, look, this is all well and good for human beings, but you're creating a situation where chimpanzees, for instance, who have very many features that we also find in humans, they're sentient, they're social creatures, according to this YouTube clip at least, they have culture. Don't you want to give them some protections that are similar to humans, who seem to all have these features as well? Anne Phillips would say, we have a decision that sort of disregards or has to disregard that reality. Another problem. Finally, there are strategic justifications. Richard Kapp, who argues against the non-human rights project, has been, I think, a defender of such a strategic approach, trying to say only humans should have human rights. Animal rights are in real tension with them. He puts it as follows. He says, allowing animal legal personhood based on cognitive abilities. Right? He's referring here to the legal strategy adopted by the Non-Human Rights Project, as we will see in a few weeks. They're trying to say chimpanzees, elephants, look, they have autonomy as well. They want to lead their lives. They can plan for the future. They have features, attributes that make them deserving of rights. Cobb thinks that's a very dangerous strategy. It's a foundational strategy. It's a very dangerous one because it could unintentionally lead to the gradual erosion of protections for the especially vulnerable, in this case cognitively disabled, human beings. Because it might turn out that they lack those relevant features, right? That animal rights thinkers are saying it's all about. He goes on in a rhetoric, powerful way. He says, the sky would not immediately fall if courts started treating chimpanzees as persons, but over time both the courts and society might be tempted to not only view the most intelligent animals more like we now view humans, but also to view the least intelligent humans more like we now view animals. Right? So that's his fear, and out of that strategic consideration, if you like, he says we should reject animal rights claims. The courts should reject habeas corpus on behalf of chimpanzees and elephants. And he has filed numerous amicus curiae briefs making that argument, and many courts have found him to be compelling. So in other words, then, making thick rights or legal personhood dependent on individual capacities, right, would undermine the rights or threaten to undermine the rights of the most vulnerable human beings because they may lack those capacities. So he says, let's just focus on who's a human being. If you are, you're in, you're a member of the club. That's all that matters. In addition to the more philosophical threat, if you like, to vulnerable human beings' rights, he says, granting rights or personhood to animals would also lead to a proliferation of litigation, right? Courts might be flooded with animal rights claims. Maybe cows are going to be, filing their rights claims as well. And that would take away valuable resources from human rights cases. So there's another threat there. Now, in some of my own research, I have referred to that broad view, and it's been a bit of an umbrella view as we've seen. There's different sub-approaches, if you like, but I've referred to it as an aristocratic conception. This view that humans have a very high status and animal rights are in tension with it, are a problem, we should not go there. Specifically, this aristocratic conception says all and only human beings should have these special rights, that special status, because they're born human, right? We literally saw philosophers, the American Convention on Human Rights saying, simply in virtue of being human, right? Quite reminiscent of how perhaps noble persons are seen to belong to their class simply in virtue of being born into it. And humans are viewed as special, right? We're special beings, we have special features, rational autonomy, language, whatever is your favorite feature. And we have equal rights and dignity in the same way as, again, maybe a noble person, they have their special privileges that farmers didn't have, for instance. And importantly, not because of individual merit, right? You didn't deserve your way into the aristocracy. You were born into it, right? Maybe you were completely lacking in intelligence or other talent. You would still have those privileges. Didn't matter. And likewise, you might be a really talented peasant, perhaps. But you did not deserve the privileges. So there's some parallels here in what's going on. Now, let's look now also at the opposing view, the opposing extreme, if you like, that says there's a perfect harmony between animal rights and human rights. You don't need to worry about undermining human rights, granting rights to animals. It's increasingly prominent, I think, this view, especially in animal rights scholarship, but you also see it among some human rights scholars. The idea is human rights and animal rights, if you look closely, they're really cut from the same cloth. And so if you support one, you're automatically also supporting the other. We also came across similar notions in Tom Regan, for instance, so this will be somewhat familiar to you, I think. Alistair Cochrane, I'm picking him as the best illustration for this particular view, but in essence, a lot of animal rights scholarship tries to broadly make this general point. Cochrane says the current exclusion of non-human sentient beings, i.e. animals, from human rights thinking and practice is arbitrary and unjustified, right? For the reasons we've identified before. If we're focusing on just human species membership, there's a problem of speciesism. And if you're focusing on some specific characteristics, it might just be that animals have it too, or that not all humans have it. So this seems arbitrary and unjustified to exclude all animals. Then he goes on to say, the basic rights of sentient humans and non-humans are neither conceptually nor ethically distinct. Right? They're cut from the same cloth, if you like. They're part of the same normative enterprise. Why does he think that? Why does he think human rights and animal rights are part of the same normative enterprise? Now, Cochrane defends an interest-based rights approach. We came across this distinction between will-based approaches to rights and interest-based approaches to rights in our legal theory sessions. Essentially, if you will recall, interest-based approaches say you have a right to something if you have an interest that is sufficiently weighty to impose a duty on someone else to protect that interest. And you also have to have an inherent value. Cochrane thinks that that's the best rights approach, as indeed many animal rights folks think. And he says it's the best approach, not just to animals, but also to explain why humans have rights. Children, humans with disabilities, all these potentially vulnerable human beings, they don't have human rights just because they belong to the human species. That's arbitrary. They don't have human rights because they have culture. That kind of doesn't make sense, and they're not the only ones, right? So he rejects all these approaches and says they have rights because they're sentient creatures at the end of the day who have interests in certain things, such as not suffering, for instance, and therefore they have rights. But turns out that animals have potentially rights for the exactly same reasons, right? They too are sentient, and they too have some similar interests. Bodily integrity, potentially life, liberty, and others, right? So what explains rights in humans, their sentience, their interest in certain things, also extends to animals. It logically also applies to anyone else who has the relevant sentience, the relevant interest. Here's a quote where he makes this a bit clearer. He says, if all sentient creatures, including humans, possess some rights and possess them for the same reasons, because they are sentient, because they have the relevant interest, we also have a case now for thinking of them as part of the shared scheme of what he calls sentient rights. In other words, there are reasonable grounds to question the legitimacy of having a list of basic rights, human rights, exclusive to one species. Do you see what he's doing here? He's saying, look, if it turns out, as he thinks it's the case, that there is another ground, another foundation for rights, which is you being sentient and you having interests that are sufficiently weighty to create rights, then we should start using the term sentient rights instead of human rights, because humans are not the only ones who have that relevant ground, right? That explains why they have rights. Yes, they have rights, of course, but so do some others. So what's really doing the work here is sentience, not being human. Therefore, we should rename this whole normative exercise, he thinks. This is just one example, but Cochrane and other animal rights thinkers take an opposing conception, if you like, to this aristocratic one that I described before. I call this one the meritocratic conception. It focuses very much on individual desert, individual merit. Do you as an individual have what it takes, basically? Again, sort of reminiscent of some historical ideas. Just to spell it out here, people like Cochrane, other animal rights thinkers say that animals deserve fundamental rights because they are sentient individuals. Right? As sentient individuals, they have certain interests. Being alive, being free, maybe being with companions, with family, say, depending on the individual. At least some, maybe not all of these interests, but some of these interests are really weighty, they're really important, and they may impose duties on others, therefore giving them certain rights under the interest-based rights theory. And importantly, we're just focusing on individuals here. We're not focusing on groups, right? Because group-based exclusions, humans only if you like, they're arbitrary, right? Speciesism, again. So we're just focusing on the individual and whether the individual deserves something based on their possession of sentience or some other feature, autonomy in the case of the Non-Human Rights Project. Now, we saw some issues with this foundationalist approach. It tries to ground things in the capacities of individuals at the end of the day, and a lot of animal rights scholarship is doing that. We've already seen some issues with that, so what I'd rather like to do now is just go through some considerations from research in psychology that people like Cochrane and like-minded thinkers tend to adduce when trying to make their case for sentient rights, for saying that human rights and animal rights are in harmony with each other. One concept that social and moral psychologists have devised is this notion of social dominance orientation. It's basically a concept that tries to describe attitudes toward social hierarchies and how much an individual values social hierarchies. Some individuals value them more or think more in terms of hierarchies than others. Right? So social dominance, basically. And it turns out, as research by Dont and others, which you'll find on the handout if you're interested, has shown, is that speciesist attitudes correlate with discriminatory attitudes toward human outgroups. In other words, research shows that if you are saying that only humans matter, you are not more likely, as perhaps intuitively we would think, to protect vulnerable human groups. You're in fact less likely to do so, right? You're more likely to also have racist views, statistically speaking, sexist views and ableist views, if you are also a speciesist, interestingly, right? This would seem to go exactly against what people like Kupp are thinking. Very interesting. So it's a strong correlation between speciesism and other isms, if you like, other discriminatory attitudes. There's a related psychological phenomenon called dehumanization. This is basically the idea of taking someone's humanity, at least metaphorically speaking, by comparing them to an animal, say. And it turns out that the more the divide is emphasized between humans and animals, the easier it is, and the likelier it is, that humans will be characterized as animals. Certain unwanted human groups will be characterized as animals, and potentially also the detrimental effect on these groups will be larger the more this gap is emphasized. Again, a pretty straightforward conclusion, if you like. The more you say animals are something base, something lower, the more, of course, humans will suffer that are compared to those animals, right? And so the counter consideration basically is, well, the less you think of animals as something lesser, the less of a detrimental impact will it have for humans to be compared to them. And in fact, probably it won't happen as often, because the very reason why usually someone would compare someone to an animal is to show that there's something that's not as valuable as they are. Okay, one last concept, again, along similar lines, moral expansiveness scale. This is a scale that some researchers have come up with, Crimston and others, that basically tries to measure how expansive, how large your moral concern is. What do you extend your moral concern to? just what's sort of around you, or do you go beyond that? And the larger it is, well, we would think the better. And it turns out, again, I think here unsurprisingly, that humans who extend their moral concern to animals, perhaps if they're vegan or if they donate to animal charities, these humans, statistically speaking, are also more likely to show moral concern toward human outgroups, right? In a sense, this is linked to what we saw before about the social dominance attitude. So you're more willing to donate to human rights causes if you donate to animal rights causes, right? If you want to sort of put it shortly. Okay. Now, Joe Wills, Brian tells me that apparently the piece, you'd have to access it, I think, from the electronic deposit, so somewhere from a university computer, but the university should have access to it. He draws some conclusions from that, and specifically responding to Kopp, and Will says, turns out then, individuals who highly value chimpanzees, including up to the point of campaigning for their legal personhood, such as the Non-Human Rights Project, are more rather than less likely to have moral concern for cognitively disabled human beings, suggesting precisely the opposite of Kopp's fears. Right. Now, Kopp has some other points too, but I think Will's point here is well taken, that the picture is much more complicated. Right? Just because you're supporting animal rights doesn't mean you don't want to support cognitively disabled human beings. It turns out, psychologically speaking, you're more likely to see the two as indeed a shared normative enterprise, if you like, if you want to use Cochrane's terms. Okay. Now, very briefly, I think the picture is somewhat more complicated. Again, there's also another concept that doesn't feature, I think, in Will's article, and that's the concept of mortality salience. It turns out that human beings tend to be reminded of their own mortality if they get too close to animals. The idea is essentially that animals, because of their sort of bodily, material, existences, they tend to remind us that we are ourselves, in fact, mortal creatures. Right? And it turns out that, again, statistically speaking, an overemphasis on similarities between humans and animals tends to lead people to have defensive reactions, in fact, leading to negative attitudes toward animals and human outgroups, right? So there can be the inverse effect if you go too far in emphasizing similarities between humans and animals, or at least if you get too close to an animal. At least that goes for some people, it seems. So just to let you know, this sort of research, again, the picture is a bit more complicated than perhaps Will's might suggest. There are some practical ways forward, we think. Now, I think it's obvious that some conflict between human rights and animal rights will be inevitable, but it doesn't mean that they can't be resolved, right? So think of the right to life versus the right to economic freedom, for instance. So assume, under an animal rights, framework, Matilda, our cow, would have a right to life. Of course, there's humans, there's farmers, there's businesses that have a right to economic freedom, right? What exactly would that mean? Because there is obviously potential conflict here, prima facie at least, right? The farmer would want to, essentially kill Matilda and sell her flesh. Essentially, that is what's going on. Whereas Matilda has an interest, of course, in remaining alive, at least if you take that view. However, that doesn't mean there's no way of resolving this. In fact, courts do that all the time. Right? Courts are constantly confronted with the need to balance different rights. So in this situation, a court would have to ask itself, does it weigh the right to economic freedom more than Matilda's countervailing right to life, in which case the right to economic freedom would outweigh the right to life? Or indeed, perhaps the court will find that the cow's right to life is stronger than the countervailing right to economic freedom. Again, this is something the courts are doing all the time in human rights adjudication. This is not a new problem, and therefore there's no reason to believe that there's some irresolvable conflict here that no one knows how to deal with. It's just a question of how these things are balanced. In some of my own work, I made an alternative suggestion, again, trying to find a sort of middle ground between the two extremes that we outlined before, the aristocratic conception, the meritocratic conception. My proposal in some of my research was, well, we could just try to extend some of the thick rights, some of the personhood, dignity too, if you like, not on the basis of an animal's individual capacities, but on their species membership, right? We may say that philosophically speaking or morally speaking, species membership is arbitrary. That doesn't necessarily mean that in law it's not a good criterion to use, right? In fact, I believe it's a pragmatically expedient criterion. Which species do you belong to? It's easier for judges to tell, okay, this is a chimpanzee. The judges are not specialists in chimpanzees. They're not, anthropologists or zoologists. It will be sufficient for them to know this is a chimpanzee, so prima facie they may have access to these and these rights. It allows them to err on the safe side if they don't quite know, is this a chimpanzee that has an interest in autonomy or not? Generally, most chimpanzees do, so they don't have to go into the individual capacities, thereby avoiding the potential problem that we saw in the human rights context with maybe leading down the path of taking away some rights of humans that we don't want to go down. It is also politically wise, I think, in that it allows us to uphold the commitment to equality, right? We can still say humans have human rights based on their species, right? We don't need to go down the potentially dangerous foundationalist path, while still allowing to extend certain rights and personhood to deserving species, right? So you have the element of desert, but you just focus on the species. And you have the element of protecting equality, but you don't just focus on humans, you allow an extension, right? So it tries to sort of find a middle ground here between these conceptions. There's other practical ways forward. I'm just flagging one here, but we're almost out of time. So just the feminist ethics of care that we already came across. You'll remember that they really emphasize this idea of interrelated oppressions, right? Intersectionality. We came across this term last term, and how these oppressions can only be eliminated if they are attacked together rather than separately. And Adams talks here about the overlap between speciesism and sexism and others. We already discussed those notions. So another potential way forward, focusing on oppressions, on vulnerability, which again is eventually shared. Okay, very good. Just to conclude then, we saw that claims that animal rights are inherently in tension with human rights are, I think, exaggerated. There's nothing inherently that is in conflict here. But it doesn't mean either that there's a perfect harmony. Right? So I think the situation is more nuanced, is more complex. It's messier, if you like. Some animals' rights may indeed conflict with some humans' rights, as we saw in our example. But then on the other hand, we also saw that supporting animal rights may likely boost the rights of vulnerable human beings, at least psychologically speaking. Right? So we have a very complex picture here that we cannot just tackle in these black and white terms that maybe the premise of the debate suggested. Ultimately, will be judges who will have to deal with these new questions. But again, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They have some existing tools that they can use, such as proportionality balancing, that they have already successfully applied in other domains. And there's nothing here suggesting that this couldn't work with regard to animals. Lastly, and just as an outlook to the next two lectures, human rights are in another perhaps strategic way also not in tension with animal rights. And that's insofar at least as they have been used by some animal rights advocates to try to further human rights. So perhaps veganism, for instance, freedom of conscience, and how veganism and through protecting humans as vegans, we can protect animals, for instance. Just one example. You'll be discussing more examples in the next 2 lectures, when again, Percy Hughes will be talking about the ECHR and animal rights. So there's more to come on this topic. Very good. Thank you very much. Apologies again for the technical problems. And yeah, I'll look forward to the discussion if you have any comments or questions. Thank you.